are a collaborative based out of Waterloo region in Southern Ontario with a focus on climate change mitigation within our 8 local municipalities. To bring you today's webinar on carbon budgeting, we've partnered with Clean Air Partnership, a charitable environmental organization enabling communities to improve air quality, advance active transportation, and take bold climate action, as well as the Canadian Urban Sustainability Practitioners Network, which connects sustainability practitioners from Canada's large and leading cities and provides added capacity to support their efforts and expand their reach and impact. Today, we'll be hearing about how the cities of Edmonton and Oslo have developed and implemented carbon budgeting methodologies and share best practices and lessons learned. We have a really exciting set of speakers ahead, but before we get started, I'm just going to point out a couple of housekeeping items. So for starters, you're all muted, and we ask that you remain on mute throughout the duration of the webinar. After each presentation, we'll have time for Q&A, as well as a final Q&A round with all speakers at the end. So please use the chat function to ask questions throughout the presentations, and we will do our best to address them during the Q&A. We also ask that all participants keep your videos turned off just to save on some bandwidth for us. And we will be recording today's event, and we'll also send along a copy of the slides out to all participants. So aside from that, please enjoy. Our first speaker is Moria Braun from the City of Edmonton. Edmonton's work to integrate greenhouse gas emissions into decision-making began back in 2012 with efforts focused on internal operations. In 2019, they began developing a broader carbon accounting framework to manage community-wide carbon budget in much the same way it manages its financial budget. The draft framework is expected to be presented to City Council for approval at the end of 2020 and begin being used in 2021. So Moria has been the greenhouse gas inventory manager for the City of Edmonton for 3 years and manages the technical modeling that is informing an update to Edmonton's community energy transition strategy. She manages the city's carbon budget and has been participating in the development of the carbon accounting framework for the city. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Moria, to take it away.
So all you'll need to do, Moria, is just just share the screen, and then it'll bring up your PowerPoint.
All right.
And yeah, see your PowerPoint in slideshow format. Perfect. Thank you.
Good. Thanks very much. Well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. As Samantha already mentioned, my name is Moria Braun. I'm the Greenhouse Gas Manager for the City of Edmonton, and I'm currently also managing the technical modeling that will inform an update to our community energy transition strategy. Just to give you a little bit of background on the city itself, Edmonton is a university and a government city that has a relatively long history of working to address climate change and taking responsibility for its share of greenhouse gas emissions. One of our current initiatives in this area is the development of a carbon budgeting framework. This framework is intended to guide decision-making in the city in much the same way that a financial budget does. I'll begin with full disclosure that this work is challenging. City administrators aren't used to thinking about their plans, road networks, waste management, or recreation facilities as being responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. As we introduce this framework, they're needing to learn quickly. They're needing to learn the science of climate change and also how to quantify greenhouse gas emissions relative to the work that they do. Fortunately, however, we're not the first city to go through this process. We're following in the footsteps of the city of Oslo, and we're also learning alongside other cities. So just to give you a bit of background globally, historically, as we recognized that we were emitting too much greenhouse gas, we initially responded by setting targets like the one found in the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto target was to reduce emissions by 5% between 2008 and 2012 relative to 1990. However, as we became better able to quantify emissions and their impacts at a global scale, two things became apparent. Firstly, there's a limit to the temperature increase that the planet can endure. And secondly, our targets gave the impression that we could procrastinate and then quickly take action at the end, when in fact we were realizing that by that point it might be too late. This has led over time to global targets that are focused more on limiting the temperature increase and acting quickly. And we see this in the Paris Agreement. Since then, cities have increasingly begun working within the more structured format of a carbon budget. So what is a carbon budget? A carbon budget incorporates the temperature threshold and the urgency I just spoke of, much like a financial budget identifies your spending limit within a time frame. We define a carbon budget as the maximum amount of greenhouse gases that can be emitted worldwide without increasing the global average temperature by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's important to recognize this global context because although we operate locally as municipalities, ultimately our collective carbon budgets must not exceed the planet's limits. And this leads us to our next question, which is, what is the planet's limit? Or how much is the global carbon budget? Scientists have determined that to avoid warming the Earth more than 1.5 degrees, anthropogenic emissions cannot exceed 2,500 gigatons. But we've already emitted some. When we look back in history, we realize that we really only started emitting greenhouse gases in about 1870 during the Industrial Revolution. But as you can see here, we ramped up very quickly. The dark gray box on the left represents anthropogenic emissions between 1870 and 2011. In that time period, we emitted approximately 1,900 gigatons of greenhouse gas. That leaves us only 600 gigatons as our remaining global carbon budget. And that's the total amount that's available to be distributed to everyone to use as local carbon budgets. It's helpful to note here that 600 gigatons was the estimated balance in 2011. In 2016, it was estimated that that had shrunk to closer to 400 gigatons. Neither of these are precise estimates. The science of estimating is always improving, but the reality remains that the number is not very big. It's falling quickly. And the best way to get an accurate sense of the scale and speed of change required is to place your own municipality within this global context. So how do we go about doing that? How do we divide a global carbon budget among the world's diverse communities in a way that is just and equitable? Well, C4D, the network with which I assume most of us, if not all of us, are very well familiar, is a network of the world's megacities committed to addressing climate change. And they have developed a useful approach called convergence and contraction. With this approach, high-emitting, high GDP cities are required to begin reducing their emissions immediately. Lower-emitting, lower GDP cities can increase their emissions until 2030. So you can see that in the first stage of this model, we're converging upon a central target point. In 2030, all cities must reach or converge on a maximum emissions rate of 3.2 tons per person. From 2030 onwards, all of us will reduce our emissions or contract together until in 2050, we are all emissions neutral. This approach demands the most and fastest change comes from cities with the highest GDP, and it gives less developed cities an opportunity to catch up technologically before they have to begin reducing their emissions. Assuming that over time, the global population continues to align with current expectations, cities can use this approach to calculate a carbon budget that fits within the remaining global budget. Edmonton has used this approach to develop our own carbon budget, and it has been calculated to be 155 megatons to be used between 2019 and 2050. So having established that limit, how do we work within it? How do we begin to lay out a schedule for ourselves? Well, we begin by annualizing the total. we spread it out over the years so that the emissions are reduced as gradually as possible to make it more feasible. This graph displays our historical community emissions in dark blue, followed by our required emissions trajectory in green. The trajectory reduces our emissions fast enough to keep our total emissions within our carbon budget, and it aligns at the two key points of 2030 and 2050 with the C40's two milestones. We then aligned the carbon budget with our municipal financial budgeting process. These two processes will be working very closely hand in hand, and we hope that that makes it an easier transition for our staff and also helps us make our important project decisions at the same time. Aligning it with our financial budgeting process gives us carbon budgets for each 4-year budget cycle between now and 2050. We're currently operating in the 2019 to 2022 budget cycle, and for this period, we have a total of 66.7 megatons that our projects are allowed to release. Now let me take a moment to explain this graph. The top of the dark blue portion is where our emissions are forecast to be if we take no action. So that's the business as usual line. The top of the dark gray portion is where we need to be to align with our carbon budget. The colored wedges in between represent the actions that we've looked at, modeled, and determined to be feasible, and the extent to which we expect each of them to contribute to reducing our emissions. So the colored pathways really represent our pathway to achieve our required reductions. It consists, if you look at it in greater detail, of 26 actions across 4 broad categories. Changes to our buildings will constitute about 20% of the reductions, switching to clean energy about 37%, changes to transportation 26%, and carbon reduction through trees, technological carbon sequestration, and the purchase of offsets make up the remaining 15%. But we can't just wait for those changes to occur. We need to shape the path for our society to follow. The yellow bands here represent portions of the reductions that need to be made by the city or that the city has direct control over. From changing our zoning bylaws to require solar installations on new buildings, for example, to increasing energy efficiency of our city buildings and reducing infrastructure that encourages traditional fossil fuel vehicles. By demonstrating leadership in our own operations, regulating and encouraging the uptake of new standards and technologies, we hope to create a culture in which these changes are normalized. And as Samantha already mentioned, at an internal level and corporately, we're already operating with a carbon budget and reporting against it. But we must also consider greenhouse gas impacts for projects that are not specifically aimed at reducing emissions. And this brings us back to integrating our climate budget into our city's standard decision-making process. As I mentioned earlier, our 4-year carbon budget cycle aligns with our financial cycle. And within each of these cycles, there will be a total quantity of emissions that will be available for use by project approved in that cycle. So I'll walk you through a quick description of the process that we've put in place. At the beginning of the carbon budgeting process, in step 1, in the upper right side of this slide, all project proposals that have capital or operational budget requirements will be brought to a new entity that we're creating within our Financial and Corporate Services Department, called the Carbon Budget Office. Using an industry standard methodology, the amount of emissions expected to be eliminated or added relative to the business as usual scenario will be calculated for each project. This is a significant learning curve for us. We have experts internally who can do this right now, but to roll this out across the organization is going to be a challenge, and we realize that there will be significant training that will be required to support this. Whoops. There we go. Once we've quantified the emissions impacts of each project, They'll be compared, all of those projects will be compared to the available carbon budget, and they will be prioritized along with the other factors that we currently take into account when we prioritize them before presenting them to our City Council. So their financial costs and returns, as well as their impact on the carbon budget, will be summarized, and they will be prioritized taking all of those factors into consideration. From a greenhouse gas perspective, the goal will be to not approve a suite of projects for the period that will exceed that period's carbon budget. In the case, however, that a carbon deficit within a particular year or cycle is desired by the need for the projects, City Council will be made aware of the proposed deficit, and they'll need to either not approve the proposal or approve it in the knowledge that the deficit will need to be addressed. The last step in the process, and one that it's important that we don't forget about, is the process of evaluation. We expect to report on the budgeting and actual emissions of our projects annually, and I'll go into this a little bit more in a moment, but it's very important to realize that the accuracy of our forecasting requires this so that we improve as we go, but we also need to make sure that the projects continue to keep a focus on the emissions that we're committed to at the beginning of the process. In these last few slides, I'd like to show you some of the tools that make up our carbon accounting toolbox, as we call it. These tools are already being used in the context of managing our corporate operations. And beginning in 2021, key community-based projects will begin incorporating GHG quantifications into the proposals they submit to City Council. This slide shows you, in the red box at the bottom, the 4 new pieces of information that will be incorporated into the project proposals that are presented to Council. Whether the project will result in an emissions reduction or increase. If it reduces emissions, how far is it getting us towards our target for that particular area? How much of a reduction or an increase specifically do we think it will cause? And what will it cost per ton of emissions reduced? Every project will be tracked against a business as usual scenario through the lifetime of the project in a carbon accounting tool managed by the Carbon Budget Office. This tool will be updated regularly and published annually. This should ensure, as I mentioned, that progress is monitored, changes that occur along the way are tracked, and action is taken when required to ensure that emissions are reduced as expected. And it will also ensure that our ability to forecast improves over time as we learn. The data tracked within the carbon accounting tools will be published internally and to the public, ensuring that it's common knowledge within the city and is easily accessed by the public as well. This slide shows you a dashboard that was developed to keep our internal departments aware of how their own work is progressing against the targets that they've committed to, and whether they're staying in alignment with those commitments. So in summary, the objectives of developing this accounting framework are basically threefold. First of all, we want to ensure the integration of greenhouse gas emissions implications is incorporated into city governance and decision making. Secondly, we want to provide a mechanism and a framework that will allow us to track it, allow us to track trade-offs and synergies between finances and emissions, allow us to track our progress to the commitments we've made, and also enable us to be transparent. And finally, but equally importantly, we want to build carbon literacy within our organization. So where we have people who are not necessarily familiar with thinking of their projects in this context, we want to raise that awareness and understanding so that they become better planners and better able to give us the future that we're looking for in our city. And that's my quick overview. I will hand the screen back.
Great, thanks so much, Moria. We've got a couple really great questions coming through in the chat. So Jamie is asking, he says that many of us have existing community greenhouse gas inventories already and established targets. How can we easily convert our existing inventories into incorporating carbon budget principles?
That's a good question. The process that we went through took quite a long time for us to look at our complete building stock, our fleet, and all of the different components that a city manages internally, and to ensure that we're addressing things in a way that ensures that it's feasible. I think you have to have a dedicated project, and you have to have some people who are knowledgeable both about the carbon accounting processes and also have, excuse me, are able to work well with the people within the city to get their buy-in on understanding the existing energy portfolio and how that's playing out. So I would say give it a good set of resources, make sure that they're informed, and then start taking steps forward to understand the energy assets that you're managing, and then aligning those targets with them. I know that's very broad advice, but that's the starting point. From there on, it gets complicated.
Great. And a related note, he asks, how did you handle the transition in reporting progress from the annual inventory basis towards the carbon budget approach? So for example, how do you go about explaining what's a complicated concept?
I'm sorry, how do we handle the transition from, can you go over that once more?
From reporting progress from the annual inventory basis towards the carbon budgeting approach?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it comes down to how you choose to align your targets internally. So when you report on a community inventory or on a corporate inventory, you generally report on a few standard categories, like for example, scopes or sectors or fuels specifically. So you say we're using this much, we generated this much emissions because of our electricity use, or we generated this much emissions because of our fleet, that kind of a thing. So if you choose to break down your carbon budget and assign it to sectors like fleet versus buildings, for example, or if you look at it from a stationary energy perspective versus a transportation energy perspective, that will determine how you transition over to your reporting on the actual results. But it is a fairly logical transfer, I think, because those types of categories are quite similar in both the accounting process and in how you often assign allocations of finances, and in this case, emissions to a particular business unit. So I don't think it isn't that complicated in that sense, I don't believe. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. Ian is asking, is there a dollar threshold that dictates which projects go through the carbon budget analysis?
I don't believe we've assigned one right now, although if my colleagues are listening and they know of one that I wasn't aware of, they can certainly let me know. There are thresholds that we have worked with in the past to determine the feasibility of particular initiatives that we have, so that we try and balance the investment that we're expecting from municipality as opposed to perhaps a private partner or the citizens themselves in making something go forward. And we look at thresholds like that whenever we're designing programs for the community. And I expect that we will have similar thresholds when we present things to council. But I doubt that there would be a single threshold that we would be able to apply to all projects because they will be very different in their nature.
Great. Hillary's asking whether you used a software for the carbon accounting tool or if this has been done manually with Excel or something similar.
It is done in Excel, but it was developed specifically for us by a company that we contracted to help us develop exactly this tool. So it is set up specifically to handle what the City of Edmonton has asked it to do for us.
Great. Regarding this carbon budget being community-wide, Molly says she's curious to understand how cities are capturing things that happen in the community that don't necessarily go through the city budgeting. So for example, commercial and housing developments. Is there an adjustment estimate that the city council agrees to offset? Or how do you handle things like that in the budget?
Community initiatives will not be captured. Community initiatives that are not city funded will not be captured by this process. we monitor them, and we do try and keep track of them and present them in our inventories so that that information is shared more broadly. But there is no interaction of the city council decision-making process on investments that happen outside of the city's operational limitations, I guess, or authority.
Okay. I think that answers some of the other questions that have come through as well. Someone's asking about how you got your finance staff on board with this. And maybe speak a little bit about what that process was like.
I would actually not be a good person to speak to that process. We did bring someone from the financial area into our energy transition group, and then they worked with the financial people. So they're able to speak the language and understand the concerns of the financial staff, and also to develop a tool that was going to make sense to the financial staff, rather than having a tool developed by someone who only understood carbon accounting but didn't necessarily understand the complexities of financial management and financial concerns. So I think it was important that we brought somebody in who understood their world, and they were able to take the ideas back and make them as palatable as possible, and also make them work within the constraints that financial part of our organization has.
Great. And I think we'll wrap up with one of these last questions here. And then just a reminder to everyone, please keep entering your questions in the Q&A, and we will get back to them at the end of the webinar. We have a set aside Q&A section. So lastly, Kate is asking, how is the initial carbon accounting process development funded, and how is the ongoing work resourced?
The development of the process was funded by, as a specific project for our group on the energy transition team. So it was part of our, I do not know whether it was part of our operating or our capital budget, but we did get funding internally from the city to do that. I do not know what the funding is going to look like for the ongoing staff. I'm not sure whether that's been decided yet, but I am not aware of how it's going to proceed. I'm sorry.
No worries. All right. Thank you very much, Moria. We will leave it there, and then we will be back at the end with likely some more questions for you. So stay tuned. So with that, I'm going to share my screen again. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see that.
I don't see yours. Oh, yeah, here it is.
Is it there? Okay, perfect.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so next we're going to hear from Karine Hertzberg and Katrin Robertson, joining us from Oslo, Norway today. Karine is a special advisor for the International Climate Cooperation with the City of Oslo. Prior to this role, she held roles as a senior advisor for climate and environment at Norway's embassy to the US and senior advisor at Norway's Ministry for Climate and Environment. And Katrin currently serves as a climate budget advisor in the Climate Agency of Oslo, previously working as an advisor for the Norwegian Environment Agency. So Oslo's climate budget was launched in 2017, and the development of and use of it as a municipal governing tool have been considered groundbreaking by many. The idea was to create a pragmatic, efficient, measurable, and transparent system, and to count emissions the way they count money. So the carbon budget is being used to guide the city in its journey to achieving a 95% greenhouse gas reduction target by 2030. So with that, I will turn it over to Karine and Katrin.
And Karine and Katrin, all you need to do is just choose the share screen and then just let it know which screen you would like to share.
Right. Thank you so much. We're sharing this between us. I will start and Katrin will follow. So, do you see my presentation?
Not yet. I see a video right now. So let's see. And now it started share screening. And your PowerPoint is all up. Thank you so much, Corinne.
Great, thank you. So, and thank you so much for inviting us. We will share the presentation between us, as I said. I will talk about the political and governance sides of the climate budget and how it works and how it influences our governance. Katrin will go through the technical sides. And thank you, Moria, for your presentation. And I think that it really goes well in line with what we'll be talking about. And also thank you for the introduction about the science basis, which is really underlying why Oslo has a climate budget and how it's working. A little bit about Oslo. I'm trying to move to the next page.
All you might need to do is just click on that screen just to get it. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, yeah. So Katrin and I talked about that. Maybe not all of you are that familiar with Oslo. It's the capital of Norway. It's a government city and a university city. We're about 700,000 people, and it's a growing population. Now the growth in populations and the university and so on means that there's a high pressure in housing markets. Oslo is also a work hub, and there's quite a lot of commuting traffic from the surrounding areas. Oslo is also by the sea, by the fjord, but around the city is a large protected forest area, which of course limits the space of the city, and is a of huge importance to recreation. Oslo has 100% renewable energy or electricity, so we're well placed for electrification of transportation. I wanted to say that because otherwise you might be puzzled about some of the areas that we work on. So the climate strategy for 2030, and Samantha mentioned that Oslo has a target of reducing emissions by 95% by 2030. It's a comprehensive climate strategy. It was decided by a broad majority in the City Council this May. And the fact that there's a broad agreement in the City Council means that it will stand even if there should be a change of government in the city. It also covers climate adaptation. It covers forest and land use, and there is now a start of more attention to forest and land management to protect and enhance carbon storage. There is a target for reducing energy consumption and also to address indirect emissions. And not all of this is covered in the climate budget, but there are also important parts of the climate strategy, which is why I wanted to mention it. What is really important about the strategy, though, is that the target of a 95% reduction really is what directs what we do in the climate budget and directs policies and is what is entered into the overall budget where we combine the climate budget and the financial budget. So as a city in a country, there is of course a division of labor between the national government and the city government, and this has implications for what we can do about our emissions. Oslo's emissions profile is really dominated by road transport, mostly private cars and vans, but also heavy vehicles and buses. They constitute about half of our emissions. And then there is a considerable share of emissions from waste, incineration and energy supply, which is going down, and I'll explain shortly. And what is called other mobile combustion in the emissions inventory. This is really mostly construction. There are smaller shares of emissions from industry, from heating, and so on. Now, national policies are important to these sectors, mainly because the CO2 tax, which is determined nationally, of course, addresses all of these emissions. So the higher the national CO2 tax is, the more it would also help Oslo to meet our targets. At national level, there are very strong incentives for electric vehicles. Oslo has additional policies, so the share of electric vehicles in Norway is really the highest in Oslo. At the national level, there is a phase out of the use of fossil fuels for heating in buildings. So this is, the emissions from that sector are going down because of a national policy, but Oslo has been supporting a more rapid phase out. And at national level, they are now considering investment in CCS, which would mean a lot to Oslo because we have a large point source in a waste to energy plant. So what can we do at the Oslo level? What policies can we implement? We can actually do a lot. We do implement the policies around transportation, parking and zoning regulations, spatial planning, forest management. We set requirements in public procurement for, in particular now, we've moved forward with the first fossil fuel-free construction site. We're following up through a public procurement regulations that are the first of its kind in Norway to put a premium on low emission solutions. And we have various support schemes. I wanted to show this because Katrin will also say something about this probably, but to really emphasize also something that Moria said, that the interplay between the national and the local level is really important. We see, and we continue to work strategically in that way, that when Oslo can go forward in innovative and strong policies, such as requirements in public procurement, this will influence the national policy and make it stronger in the next term. So the climate budget, it's different from the Edmonton budget in the sense that we are directing our climate budget work towards the ultimately, or in the near term, towards the 95% reduction in 2030. But the vision is really to become zero emission. It is part of the municipal budget, which is developed annually, and the Vice Mayor for Finance is responsible. So my department is under the Vice Mayor for Environment and Transportation. So we do a lot of the work in preparing and developing the budget, but it's the Vice Mayor for Finance that presents the budget to the City Council. In the climate budget, the emission inventory and baselines are updated, emission reduction measures are identified, and including pointing to who is or what is the responsible unit for implementation and what are the costs. And the climate budget has lines describing all of the various measures that go into that year's budget. We are currently in the process of finalizing the next climate budget together with the overall budget to be presented in a couple of weeks, where we have been doing planning for the whole planning period, which is up to 2024, but it is also an annual budget. So having it as part of the budget cycle really gives it weight, puts it on the political agenda, and changes the way climate policies are being developed and implemented. This is an illustration of the organization of the City of Oslo, the City Council, which is kind of the parliament, the broad electorate, the city government with the governor and mayor and the vice mayors for each of the underlying departments. And we've highlighted the Department of Finance, which prepares the climate budget. They're also responsible for the procurement strategy and regulations for buildings and so on. And the Department for Environment and Transport, where we have a lot of responsibility for specific measures and an overall responsibility for climate work. You will also see, although there's a lot of text on this slide, you will see that all of the other departments also have some responsibility in terms of implementing climate policy, whether it's carbon capture and storage at Klemetsrud, which is the waste management plan, fossil-free construction, sustainable urban development, densification around transport hubs, and so on. Now, this is Our climate target, this is the pathway, hopefully, to our 2030 95% reduction. So the solid green line is the historical emissions, which have been coming down. The current city government came into office in 2015, and they're now into their second term. The dotted green line is the projection of emissions. We have some targets that have been decided by the city council, and the minus 41% by 2020, minus 52% by 2023, and minus 95% by 2030. So unlike Edmonton, we don't have the carbon budget that delineates the total emissions. We have point targets that we are tracking very closely on an annual basis through the climate budget and through the policies. Now, how do we develop the climate budget sort of at the higher level? A really important message and experience is how the climate budget drives integration of climate action into all agencies. Each of the various departments have a role of steering underlying agencies, such as my department steering the Climate Agency, as well as the City Environment Agency. And then there are a number of other agencies, not all of them under my department, but all of them get the same set of instructions at the start of the year to develop and present, analyze possible measures to reduce emissions. The Climate Agency has a very important coordinating role in going through all of the measures that are presented, going through the analysis, and ultimately present them in the climate budget to be able to go to the next level, so to speak. In the budget itself, the climate budget, there is a description of how emissions develop, whether there is a gap or not compared to meeting the target, what new measures are possible, and who will be responsible to follow up. This process means that the climate targets become central to the overall budget discussion, which is perhaps the most important fundamental change to how climate policies were developed and implemented in the past. This is I'll say a little bit about the budget process in more detail, and after that we'll move over to Katrin to go more into the technical sides of the climate budget. I just want to say one thing about the fact that we have specific point targets for specific years, but that the overall ambition is a 95% reduction in 2030, basically to be a zero emission city. This is also stated in the climate strategy. By tracking the emissions development so closely through the annual budgets, we are putting a premium on early action, on moving now to start reducing emissions as early as possible, as soon as possible. Also because of the effect of reducing emissions now will be reflected throughout the remaining period. The budget process starts with a letter with budget instructions from the Department of Finance. There is a strategic conference at political level early in the year. They also receive, based on that, budget propositions from the various underlying agencies. And then a second assembling conference early summer, where the budget is being outlined roughly. By that time, we will also have had status reports of where we are in terms of meeting the climate targets. Then there is the final budget conference around this time, and the city council presents the city government presents the budget proposition, which is then handed over to the big city council that that clears the budget resolution towards the end of the year. In the second year, so to speak, of the budget cycle, there is a first report early in the year on how the city is doing. That concerns both the financial budget and the climate budget. A second report is later in the year, and I'm sorry, someone tried to call me. And then the last report by New Year. And so there is a feedback from the reporting on both the financial side and the climate budget side that feeds back into developing the next year's budget. I would now like to give the floor to Katrin, who will go back to how the climate budget is developed in a technical way, how we work with our inventories, the analysis of mitigation measures, methodologies for improving the climate budget.
We've had two questions come in that I wonder if you wouldn't mind answering at this point before we get too far into the other presentation. One was about the emissions breakdown. So what form of energy is used to heat buildings in Oslo? I think the comment came from the fact that a 6% of emissions from buildings seems very low.
Yes, and that those emission numbers were from 2018. So they would now be down to 0, really, and Katrin can say more about that. So the main source for heating buildings in Oslo, and in fact in Norway, is electricity. We have electric panel ovens and so on. There is also some district heating, and district heating was built in Oslo perhaps about 20 years ago, and for new buildings, there's a requirement to get connected to the district heating system, but it's mostly electricity.
Great, thank you. And secondly, can you talk about why the budget is limited to the inclusion of Scope 1 emissions?
It includes all of the direct emissions in the municipality of Oslo, so the area of Oslo, so both the municipality's own emissions and other emissions. In terms of going further than that, and I think Katrin can probably add to this, we have chosen this because it is an easy and pragmatic way of getting started in what is a very necessary turnaround operation for Oslo, and also actually in our role as trying to drive higher ambitions generally in Norway. This is where we have reasonably good data. This is where we can get good analysis to underpin policies. Maybe Katrin wants to add.
I can talk a little bit about it when I go through my presentation.
Perfect, thank you.
Should I just try to share my screen now?
Yes, all you need to do is just choose the screen that if you just share that screen, or if you have multiple screens, just let it know which screen you want to share.
And I stop sharing, right?
Thank you. I see the presentation now, so you just want to go into slideshow mode and then just choose the one, the PowerPoint you'd like to start from.
Okay. So my name is Katrin Robertson. I'm the technical advisor on the climate budget at the Climate Agency in Oslo. Our agency consists of about 40 specialized advisors on climate, and that is our main task, to work towards reducing the emissions and, of course, make sure that the city is resilient to the climate change. I will give a more technical presentation on how we develop and manage the climate budget. And I hope it will provide a better understanding of how the climate budget works in Oslo, and also perhaps give some advice to those who consider developing a climate budget. I want to emphasize that a climate budget can be developed in many forms, and I will focus on how we do it in Oslo in regards to emission inventories and emission budgeting. Right, so the system boundaries of the climate budget. The first step is always to ensure that you have a system in place, and the Oslo budget contains only scope 1 emissions. Thus, we do not include the indirect emissions, and we do not have consumption-based emissions in our analysis. And this is mainly due to lack of data. We have a really good emission inventory on the direct emissions. We know from past analysis that the indirect emissions may be somewhere between 7 to 12 times higher. But since we don't have these numbers annually, we have limited the boundaries to only contain those emissions that we actually can control and track. Furthermore, the climate budget covers the geographical area of Oslo, not only the city administration's emissions. That is because the administration emissions is less than 10% of total emissions. But we do include all emission sectors in the emission inventory. We have a combination of national, regional, and local measures, and a combination of quantified and non-quantified measures. And as you can see, the targets on indirect emissions, energy, adaptations, and LULUCF are not included in our climate budget. So on the historical greenhouse gas emissions, we have data from 2009 to 2018. And good data is essential in order to develop the climate budget. Fortunately for us in Oslo, we have the Norwegian Environment Agency, which is responsible for the compilation of the inventory for all municipalities in Norway. It is an annual publication with a 2-year delay, and the methodology follows the national inventory. The inventory contains 3 pollutants: CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, and it covers for Oslo 8 emission sectors. As Corinne said, our largest emission source are road transportation, followed by waste incineration and other mobile combustion. And after, I have the most recent numbers with me here today. After years of a decrease in emission levels, we now see that they are rising. And this is mainly due to higher activities in the construction and building sectors, but also due to reduced use of biofuels in road transportation. Cicero Center of Climate Research has developed a projection of how emissions may develop in Oslo towards 2030, given the policies that we adopted per 2018. And as you can see, total emissions are expected to decrease due to 4 important policies. It is the national ban on fossil fuels in heating of buildings from 2020, a national requirement of 20% use of biofuels in the transport sector, a toll ring surrounding Oslo City, and subsidies and other instruments which lead to an electrification of the transport sector. Population growth and economic growth are expected to lead to higher emissions from waste incineration and other mobile combustion. So this is the same slide as Corinne showed, but I want to use it as an illustration of the 2020 budget, which is the last budget that we have presented. We are now currently working on the 2021 budget, which will be available in just a couple of weeks. The 2020 budget covers the years 2020 to 2023, and we used the historical and projected emissions when we calculate the climate budget. It is important to look at how emissions will develop in the future to make sure that we do not underestimate how much we must reduce the emissions in total and per sector. So we use the budget process to identify and implement measures and instruments that would close the gap between the projected emissions here in the dotted black line and the targets that you can see. I want to show you some examples in the mobility sectors. These are some measures and instruments that we have been able to quantify the effects of. So in order to close the gap to our targets, the city government used the whole toolbox for instruments, and we see and we have been able to quantify the effects of the road user payment system, or what we call the toll ring surrounding the city, the effects of fossil-free public transportation, zero-emission construction sites, zero-emission utility and goods transportation, and active mobility or increased cycling, and electric vehicles and machinery in our own administration. Now, our analysis indicates that emissions will be reduced by 33% in 2020 and 39% in 2023. This is based on data from last year. They are out of date now, and the analysis that we will publish in 2 weeks will be more up to date with the current numbers. But what we can see from this analysis is that the mitigation effects and the measures, they are not enough to ensure that we reach our targets in these years. Now, the estimates are generated through a combination of methodologies, and there are a number of measures that we have not been able to quantify. This is, for example, due to the lack of good data. There will always be some uncertainty in connection with these analyses, but we do believe that the emission levels in Oslo in 2020 and 2023 will be somewhere between the quantified effects and the targets. But when we see that our efforts are not enough, the climate budget shows its strength as an effective governance system. The city government wants to further develop the road user payment system as an instrument to reduce emissions from the transportation sector. They look into the possibility of a fossil-free city center. They want to ensure and study how to get effective and fossil-free buses, not only those public transport, but other buses as well. They look at ways to ensure fossil-free transport of excavated masses, and they study measures to reduce the fossil components in waste incineration. Now, this is an annual budget cycle, and we use monitoring and reporting to track how things are going. And through the ordinary budget process, we ensure reporting 3 times a year, as Corinne said. We have defined targets and key performance indicators per measure. In addition, we have a climate parameter, which consists of 17 indicators that gives us a picture of how well our measures are working. And these results are published on our website 3 times a year. Now I want to give the floor to Corinne again, if she's on.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. So some lessons learned. I think I emphasized this at the beginning as well, but what is really an important lesson is how the climate budget puts climate policies and measures at the center of the policy discussions. It really is efficient and extremely important in mainstreaming climate action, which is really the way to go, or which is crucial if Oslo is going to meet its vision of becoming zero emission, if Norway is going to meet its goals under the Paris Agreement, or if the Paris Agreement overall is going to succeed, Paris Agreement having a long-term aim of net zero emissions globally. So integration into all of the governing, the practices and running of the city. Ensuring ownership across agencies and placing responsibility for implementation. Of course, the Department for Environment and Transport does not have all of the powers to actually implement the different measures, so it does need to be placed broadly. There is a formal process for input and analysis on measures. Again, this is related to making all of the various agencies responsible. Agencies that don't have as their primary responsibility to deliver climate action, but that have a very important role. For instance, the Agency for Planning and Buildings, or all of the different agencies that have responsibilities in transportation. When they are being tasked with presenting measures to reduce emissions or to implement low emission, zero emission solutions, that has a significant effect. One lesson is that it's important to keep focus on the overall impact, on where the big emission sources are, that you address the big chunks of emissions, even though you might have difficulties with getting good data on those big chunks of emissions or big sources, and it might be challenging to get good data on measures that can address the large emissions. It can be somehow tempting to do a lot of work on measures where you have good data, but it's given that you don't have unlimited resources, it's important to keep focus on the important areas of emissions. We say that you can do complicated calculations on very small measures. They can be very, very good. And it's like my statistics teachers once said, it's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. We're not there, but keeping focus on where you have the largest impact. The large one, I think, is a common one, so which Catherine might want to add to, but communication, cooperation, and transparency. And we are continuously working not just with the agencies in the municipality, but with the private sector, with various business and industry, from those that are looking into getting an electric van for small-scale deliveries, to huge international companies that deliver construction machinery to get them over to electrification. So it's a very broad outreach exercise as well. Catherine, do you want to go on?
Just that we have a high focus on climate communication and cooperation with other stakeholders. We also have a network for businesses. So we use them when we want to test out different measures and see whether or not they are actually possible to undertake. And last but not least, as I can see from my point of view as a technical advisor, that transparency throughout the whole process in the numbers is key to actually be successful in using a climate budget. Now we can open for questions.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. That was fantastic. A number of questions came through here. So one I'll start with, it's just a clarification on one of the earlier questions around the electricity source. Is your electricity 100% renewable, or is it just not included because it's a scope 2?
I can answer that. I would say the Norwegian electricity is 99% renewable hydropower. And in the emission inventory, it has 0 emission factor.
Great. Is there a cost of inaction factored into staff reports, or the cost of indirect actions related to others that might affect achieving the carbon budget in future years?
I can start. I did follow the chat a little bit when Katrin was presenting, so I thought about that question. I'm not quite sure if I understand it. So, talking about if you're thinking about the cost of inaction being that you can not meet the climate budget in certain years, or you lag behind, or that the effects of the measures that are implemented now can be reversed at a later stage. I think the perspective on what we're trying to do in Oslo is very much to change overall the way the city operates, the way people live in Oslo. So we're changing transportation patterns, we're changing infrastructure, we're changing buildings and houses, we're changing the waste system to a better way of doing things. So it's going to be a better and more livable city. This is also part of the vision for the city government. And it means that they are not so easily reversed necessarily. So that's one thing. The other one is the city government, having put forward very high ambitions on climate change, having got a broad political buy-in in the city council for the climate strategy. The major parties that would be the opposition are also behind this climate strategy. They have also committed to meeting these targets and to getting the annual climate budget consideration, which means that the risks of this being reversed is lower. Having said that, of course, there are areas that are that you can't completely control, related to national level policies and so on. I don't know if that really answered the question though. But Katrin, maybe you want to add.
I'm not sure if I understood, but was the question whether or not we sanction the different agencies if they do not deliver? Could you please repeat the question?
Sure, yeah. And Allison, if you're still on the line, if you want to jump in and clarify, feel free to. But the question is around whether or not you factor the cost of inaction, like the cost of doing nothing, or is that type of language or communication integrated into the reporting mechanisms?
Yeah. Yeah, well, throughout the reporting cycle, we do follow up on each measure with each agency. And if we see that we are not on track, we have to find ways to solve that. And that's why I'm saying that transparency is key, because we do want to make sure that each of these measures are actually followed up on. But we still have actions that might lead to increased emissions. And that is why we are trying to develop a different approach now, where we look at the budget itself and we go through all of the plans and we look at the climate consequences of each plan, each investment, sort of like the city of Edmonton is doing.
Great, thank you. We've had a question about your waste incineration facility. Aside from carbon capture and storage, are there other strategies you're looking at to address emissions from that facility?
You Renan Tomei's mom? Yeah. I'm River's dad.
Yeah, I remember. Hi, I can
Hi.
remember your name.
Tanner.
Tanner. Nice to see you again.
Yeah. Yeah, so school's back in, huh?
Yeah. Did he start today?
Yeah.
Corinne, would you like to answer that?
Oh, yeah, last name.
Yes, I can start. So yes, there are other measures than CCS that we're looking into and analyzing for waste management. One thing is to reduce the share of fossil-based waste, such as plastic waste, and putting that into more recycling and more reuse of materials. We'll be working towards more circular economy approach. Of course, the first premise is also to reuse the waste altogether, the volume of waste. We see that we won't be able to quite get there We are using or working to continue to use biogas. So there are a number of measures that we are continually working on, but we do see that CCS would be a very important measure, even though we will be doing these other things.
Great. And just to clarify, Oslo's carbon budget is corporate or for the municipality and not necessarily the broader community. Is that correct?
It's for the broader community. It covers the area of Oslo, all emissions in the area of Oslo. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. So one of the questions that came through was around how does Oslo handle some of the externalities, such as behaviors of individual households or local businesses, or changes at the national or regional level that would impact your budget?
We are trying through a combination of measures to kind of drive behaviors in a more climate friendly, low emission way. Through, for instance, parking restrictions and the toll ring, they give incentives to reduce car use. At the same time, there are incentives at national level to use an electric car if you need to have a car. They're pretty strong incentives. I think anyone who would buy a new car in Norway today would get an electric one. The same goes on other areas, for instance, related to the phase out of using fossil fuel oils for heating in buildings, which wasn't a very large share of emissions, but it was being phased out through national legislation, in fact. But Oslo supported changing that and linking up to the district heating network instead of using heating oil in buildings. So it's about a combination of stick and carrots, you could say, and some of the sticks and carrots are at municipal level and some are at national level. So we're trying to strengthen the policies that also we try to strengthen what is coming as national level policies. Katrin, maybe you have some more examples?
Well, in addition to the climate communication, as I talked about earlier, we have a subsidy scheme directed towards businesses and private people. Where we give subsidies in order to ensure, especially in transportation, to make it easier for them to make climate-friendly choices.
For instance, I live in a sort of a cooperative housing, and the city of Oslo can give us support to install chargers for the cars. That is helpful.
Absolutely. Excellent. All right. We've got two questions in particular here that I'd like to open up to both Corinne and Katrin and also Moria. So one of the questions that came through is around the fact that a lot of staff reports and policies are being asked to look through many different lenses. So for example, an equity lens on top of a climate lens, or a recovery lens, racial equity, etc. How have Oslo and Edmonton found that the carbon and climate budgets are able to incorporate or compete with or integrate with those different lenses? And maybe we'll start with Moria. Do you want to jump back in?
Sure. I'd say it's definitely something that we've increased the attention that we're paying to it, even significantly within the last year. It's probably reflected more, the attention that we're paying to it is probably reflected more in the update that we're doing to our energy transition strategy, which outlines the types of programs and incentives and the specific ways that we want to ensure that everything that we support is just and equitable than it is specifically within the carbon budget. But that being said, when we do quantify the greenhouse gas emissions that a new project will either reduce or emit, we are also looking at some of those additional co-benefits that can sometimes relate to these types of topics. So when we have a situation, for example, in Alberta, where we have huge numbers of oil and gas workers who have lost their jobs in the last few years due to the downturn in fossil fuels. We're very much looking at how we can redeploy those people in a green energy situation so that we benefit from their skill sets and we transition that whole workforce over and into a new reality. So it definitely takes shape in our strategy, and some of those factors will be reflected in the information that we provide along with our project proposals, but I wouldn't say that it plays a really direct role in the carbon budgeting specifically.
I can say a little bit about it from the Oslo perspective. Just first of all, to say that the city government platform, their governing platform, does also raise equity issues as a really important area of policy making and of running the city. Oslo is a kind of socioeconomically a quite divided city. There are large differences between the eastern and the western side of the city in terms of income, in terms of lifespan and health, education, and so on. So and these equity issues have been in Oslo for many, many years. And when Oslo is at the same time working to introduce very ambitious climate policies, change some of the patterns in terms of housing, transportation, and so on, of course, the equity dimension is being looked at very closely. There are some specific areas where there has been a lot of discussion and where not all of these policies have been very popular. For instance, the toll ring generated a lot of political discussion last year, and so on and so forth. So just to sum up, yes, this is being considered by the city government as part of their sort of overall projects. Co-benefits are being included and quantified to the extent that that's possible. Some of the areas where we have lower levels of income and so on are also the ones that are more exposed to air pollution, for instance. And there is a separate program now being rolled out for the outer cities where these issues are the most prevalent.
Great, thank you for that. That's really helpful. Again, a question for both teams. How did you bring the community on board? I know there's been a lot of talk about communication and transparency, but the example here was, is there an individual carbon budget to help individuals make decisions that will help progress, or any other tools related to that?
I think Oslo should respond to this question because it was my colleague who asked it. So she knows the answer from Edmonton.
I would say that I can start, and Katrin, I think, should follow. There are a number of measures that are being introduced in workplaces, on, for instance, smart job travel in schools, when it comes to both travel, canteens, and so on, that can help and stimulate to make the right choice. But we haven't set this individual carbon budget per person, so it's not built on that concept, but it's built on what would be good choices where you can get the benefit from the climate policies, and at the same time have what we think would be a good life. Katrin, you can say more about the communications outreach, because that's really a lot of that's being done by the Climate Agency.
Yeah, we have actually a communications department that actively work on guidance and try to motivate to change behavior. And they do that in many different forms. They are on social medias. We have a web page. We use where we write many sort of inspiring articles, where the whole idea is to try to not only change how they see Oslo, but actually change their behavior. And every year we have this, we research whether or not they are actually responding to these measures and these efforts that we make. But as Corinne said, we do not have a carbon budget or sort of that type of approach for per person in Oslo. And when that is said, this does not only include the direct emissions. This includes the more broader aspect of the climate work that we do in Oslo, also the indirect emissions, consumption-based emissions.
Great, thank you. Another question here, thinking about the current state of different economies and unemployment rates given COVID or previously existing situations, how are the carbon budgets holding up during this trying time that we're currently in? Any comments on that, especially around influencing council and city partner decisions when there's so many other issues on the plate?
I can reply.
You can
It's definitely going to be a significant challenge. We're bringing this work to council preliminarily in October and then in more detail in the new year. And we recognize that with the pressure that has been exerted upon our city during this time, it will be more challenging to demonstrate the importance of this. However, that said, we also participate in the community that says that this is an opportunity for us to take advantage of a moment in time when our traditional ways of doing things are being paused. And if we can recognize some of the improvements we can make, and climate change, all the things we're doing to stop climate change definitely falls into that category, then let's make this moment a moment when we benefit from that opportunity rather than allowing ourselves to be completely overwhelmed by a challenging financial situation. So that's an idealistic view, but I think it's also a very practical one, and the challenge will be to convey that in a way that allows council to feel confident moving forward with this. So it's challenging, but I think there's a very compelling argument there.
Thanks, Maria. Anything from the Oslo perspective?
I think the sense is quite similar to what Maria said about Edmonton. Oslo was the hotspot for COVID-19 in Norway for a long time. It's gone down, but being the largest city and a lot of people living closely, then of course there's a continued concern about the actual situation with transmission of COVID-19. The main challenge in Oslo in many ways is transportation and the concern about public transportation being an area for transmission of COVID-19. And Norway being far north and pretty cold, when winter comes, this might be a challenge because not that many people will probably continue to cycle. Which we've seen a great upsurge in cycling. No, I think as Maria, there is the continued will to continue working on the climate, to meet the climate targets, continue using the climate budget, continue developing good measures that can actually work also while we're handling COVID-19. I think that's probably what we can say.
Yeah, I can add to that because we're just finalizing the next year budget. The climate budget is chapter 2 of the ordinary financial budget, and they prioritize between the measures, which means that they also take into, the equity issues as you just talked about earlier. But what we see is that they continue to be very ambitious on meeting the emission reduction targets here in Oslo. And a lot of the instruments that we have in our toolbox actually does not give any costs to the city administration. And that is important to remember, that not everything actually gives, or in a difficult economic time, not everything costs money. So make sure to use the whole toolbox.
Great. Thank you so much. There's one last question that just came in that I'm going to ask. It's specifically for Oslo. But in the meantime, Gabby, jump in if I've missed any glaring questions in the chat. So this is from Kate for Oslo. From a climate perspective, are you glad that Oslo produces energy from waste, or do you find that that's an ongoing challenge?
For Oslo, this is seen as a good solution. The energy goes to a district heating system that is good and efficient for in many ways. I think the important issue is what goes actually into the district heating. Can we reduce the fossil share of that? Can we move towards more bioenergy, for instance, and build the waste to energy plant into more of a into becoming a more sustainable waste to energy plant? Yeah, anything to add, Katrin?
Well, we have three large. Sorry.
And the CCS, of course, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, we have three large incineration plants in Oslo, and as well as the waste that we create or inside the city, we actually import a lot of waste to one of our incineration plants, and it's part of our inventory, even though it does not come from the people that live inside the city. But what we see is that the imported waste, it will probably be put in landfills other places. So if we get in place a CCS in Oslo, that would be a better option and better for the climate and environment.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm just gonna.
I have just one follow-up question. Just I noticed it here, and it is along the line. Sorry, it's Gabby here from the Clean Air Partnership. It has to do with the kind of sharing in terms of the methodologies or the valuation and assumptions you put into the calculations on your actual interventions and measures, and whether there's the ability to share that. I think that's one of the things that I've heard from a number of municipalities is the inventories pose one challenge of kind of pulling all the right data into your inventory. The second one is in terms of coming up with the reductions that you estimate your initiatives are going to achieve, and how that assumptions kind of like in some ways how we can kind of the question comes into it, how much kind of sharing there could be along that kind of valuation of the GHG reductions associated with measures, and if there's something that you might have some guidance in terms of how challenging it is to come up with the right numbers for the reductions that your measures are going to achieve.
I don't know, was that a question for us in that regard? I could say that we each year we compile a technical report which describes how we do these analysis, also per measure. But keep in mind that getting good data is very difficult. The uncertainty is very high. We have so many measures that we have not been able to quantify, so that should not stop you in actually adopting and using climate budget.
Thank you. And that technical report, is it available publicly?
Yeah.
Okay.
We translate it every year, so it probably will be available around New Year's.
Oh, you guys are amazing. I'll follow up and make sure we kind of get that. Thank you. And then Moria, just if you have any kind of insights in terms of the intervention calculations that Edmonton has done and the methodology that might have been used and how much you could share as a result of that analysis?
Yep, there are definitely some industry standard approaches to performing some of those calculations, and I can certainly share those with you, and you can distribute them out to whoever's listening. There's one area that's difficult, in addition to getting reliable and complete data, is tracking the potential implications of behavior change. That's something that's much more difficult than tracking a simple technological change or implementing a regulation that will result in a really clear shift in how things operate. So, but I would echo the sentiment that it's more important that you do things than that you worry about whether you'll track them perfectly, because once you start doing things, you can also see benefits that you hadn't anticipated. So that you're moving in the right direction. But yes, I can certainly share the tools that we do have access to.
Thank you, and I wholeheartedly agree. We shouldn't get too bogged down in terms of getting the numbers right. It's more important to get the implementation into the hands of people who can put it into play and help us achieve our GHG reductions. We can improve our quantification analysis over time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Well, thank you all. That concludes our webinar for today. Moria, Corinne, and Katrin, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise. It's been a pleasure to have you on the call today. To all our participants, thank you so much for joining. We'll be sending everyone a copy of the recording. And if you'd like to learn more about Climate Action Waterloo Region, Clean Air Partnership, or CUSP, please feel free to reach out. You can find contact information on each one of our websites. So with that, thank you again, and everyone have a fantastic rest of your day or evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Samantha, for pulling this all together. And thank you, everybody, for the scheduling challenges in terms of getting the West Coast to the East Coast to Europe. Appreciate that.
Excellent. Thanks all.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.